For a long period of history, armies engaged in conflicts in order to gain land, secure loyalty, and survive. A soldier's identity was based on a lord, a city, a family, or an ideology. War was extremely brutal, but it also carried a personal meaning for individuals. Then a turning point occurred. Violence became independent of loyalty. Fighting turned into a form of service and for the first time became something that could be purchased with money. Welcome to the stage of financial history. Here, money, power, and history come together. Nothing is as simple as it appears. The emergence of mercenaries did not happen through a single war or treaty. As economic structures changed, it developed gradually and almost inevitably. When money replaced land as the primary measure of power, armies adapted to this change as well. Soldiers no longer went to war because of loyalty, but because of the wages they received. Once this stage was reached, war ceased to be an extension of politics and became a business model. To understand the rise of mercenaries, it is necessary to understand what came before. In medieval Europe, armies were built on feudal obligations. Nobles were required to serve their kings for a certain period each year. Peasants were usually conscripted for short-term military service without sufficient training. These structures were unreliable, temporary, and highly inefficient. While they worked in small conflicts, as states grew larger, wealthier, and more ambitious, this system began to collapse. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, rulers faced a major problem. Wars were becoming longer, cities were growing richer, and it became necessary to protect trade routes and constantly defend borders. However, feudal obligations were insufficient to meet these demands. Loyalty was limited, service periods were short, and the willingness to die for someone else's dynastic struggle was quite low. At this point, money entered the picture. As cash economies developed, rulers realized that they could directly hire soldiers. Paying wages solved many problems. Mercenaries were professional soldiers. They trained year-round. They could be deployed quickly. They did not disappear after the harvest season. And most importantly, they fought not for belief, but for pay. This transformation was not a moral process, but entirely a logistical one. Mercenaries emerged not because kings became corrupt, but because states became more complex. Administration requires predictability. War requires reliability. And in a cash economy, reliability comes at a cost. This transformation was most clearly observed in the Italian city-states of the 14th and 15th centuries. Cities such as Florence, Venice, and Milan were wealthy, commercially advanced but politically fragile. They had money but lacked soldiers to fight. Their people were merchants, bankers, and craftsmen, and they were not eager to become soldiers. For this reason, they outsourced violence. At that point, condottieri emerged. Condottieri were mercenary leaders who managed private armies like a company. Contracts called condotta determine payment terms, duration of service, number of troops, and levels of risk. These were not uncontrolled warriors, but cautious entrepreneurs. Their armies were their capital. Losing soldiers meant losing future earnings. Therefore, the nature of war changed. Wars began to produce less decisive outcomes. Conflicts became more calculated. Open massacres were replaced by sieges. Commanders avoided unnecessary losses, not out of mercy, but because of economic logic. A well-preserved army is more valuable than a victory won through heroism, because a living soldier can be hired again, while a dead soldier has no value. This is one of the greatest ironies of the mercenary era. Although professional soldiers fought less destructively than feudal armies, They did so for far more self-interested reasons. War was no longer a matter of honor. It was about preserving capital, including human capital. However, this professionalism also had a cost. Loyalty became flexible. When payment stopped, service ended. When a more attractive offer appeared, switching sides became possible. Some commanders could even change sides at the middle of a war. In fact, some prolonged wars to increase their own profits. When violence becomes a commodity, incentives begin to follow money. This is the essence of the those who could pay could fight. Those who could not pay lost, no matter how justified they were. Gold became more valuable than the crown. This transformation affected not only the battlefield, but also the political arena. Rulers were forced to resort to taxation and borrowing to sustain their military power. Wars turned into tests of financial endurance. Victory belonged not to the bravest, but to those with the strongest financial backing. States that failed to manage their finances became vulnerable due to lack of cash. This was not a matter of courage, but of financial insufficiency. Mercenaries weakened the connection between violence and morality. A soldier defending their homeland might hesitate before harming civilians. However, someone fighting for pay must remain loyal to a contract, not to their conscience. Discipline replaced ideology, and obedience became more important than belief. The atrocities that occurred were not due to the nature of mercenaries, but due to the functioning of incentive systems. When violence becomes a service, limits must be imposed externally, and that comes with a cost. At the core of this process lies the idea that if loyalty has a price, it also has a reciprocal requirement. The mercenary revolution did not eliminate loyalty, it turned it into a value. Loyalty that can be bought can also be obtained at a lower price. Thus, a vicious cycle emerged. States tried to generate more revenue to outbid their rivals. Taxes increased and debts grew. Financial systems and military power became intertwined. War became not only a strategic issue, but also a financial one. In the early modern period, leaders began to understand the risks this system could bring. Armies that could be hired could also have their control changed. Power dependent on payment could disappear instantly. For this reason, states chose to integrate the mercenary model into their own systems. Standing armies were established in this way, not based on ideals, but on fear. Kings centralized their military structures, regulated wages, and introduced uniforms. The goal was not to restore honor, but to maintain control. Soldiers became permanent employees. Loyalty was no longer maintained through contracts, but through bureaucracy and regular salaries. On paper, the mercenary era had ended. In reality, it had been absorbed by the state. The logic remained the same. Soldiers still fought for money. The only difference was who made the payment. This system placed states under a constant financial burden. Standing armies required funding under all circumstances. Taxes increased and borrowing became widespread. The modern state was shaped to sustain this military structure. When violence depends on cash flow, war ceases to be a matter of strategy and becomes an accounting issue. States began to question not whether a war was just, but whether it was affordable. This situation affected all economic systems, and in the 18th century, warfare turned into a struggle of financial power. Britain gained an advantage not because it had the largest army, but because it built the strongest financial system. France, on the other hand, went bankrupt due to excessive spending without financial reform. In 1789, it had an army, but lacked the capacity to pay. The French Revolution was not only an ideological event, but also a financial crisis. Money did not only support war, it also influenced its outcome. This logic continued into the modern era. In the 20th century, war was framed through nationalism, but the economic system remained the same. Soldiers were paid, companies produced, and the war economy continued to function. Toward the end of the century, private military companies emerged. These were not irregular groups, but institutionalized entities. They provided a range of services from security to combat. States used these structures to reduce risks and share responsibilities. Mercenarism did not disappear, it evolved. Today, violence has once again become a service. It is managed through contracts, packaged and sold. Responsibility is diffused and accountability decreases. As violence becomes modular, starting wars becomes easier, while stopping them becomes harder. The system has become unable to resist conflict. This model mirrors the mercenary revolution. When loyalty is sold, instability becomes profitable. When soldiers become assets, peace becomes unprofitable. The modern war economy operates in the same way. Spending increases, inflation rises, and debt grows. War feeds itself. The greatest cost always falls on civilians. Taxes, inflation, and losses are imposed on them. Those with capital are protected, and those with contracts profit. The conclusion is simple. Whoever controls the money controls the violence. Whoever controls the violence determines the system. This is not a moral issue, but an issue of incentives. The mercenary revolution offers a lesson that remains relevant today. When power is for sale, ethics lose their value. History does not repeat itself exactly, but for those who do not understand it, the outcomes never change. The moment armies began to fight for gold, war ceased to be an exception and became a component of the system. This is not because people changed, but because the calculations did. If this gave you a different perspective, subscribe. History holds the answers.